Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beitel. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. The strapline and selling point of this podcast is that we don't talk about women, we showcase women. But today we are going to talk about women, about the astonishing Gisèle Pelicot, survivor of repeated rapes organized by her husband while she was drugged unconscious, and about the girls and the women at the heart of the disgusting Jeffrey Epstein affair. Difficult, to say the least. The two women we are showcasing today to discuss these very difficult issues are Katrin Bennhold, host of The World, which is a wonderful title, but in fact is the New York Times newsletter, and Elisa Braun, chief Brussels correspondent at Euractiv. Hi, ladies. Thank you so very much for joining me.
Thank you, Lana. Hi.
Thanks.
As ever, do tell us about yourself. Elisa, tell us a bit about yourself and your career.
So I'm a French journalist and I was based in Paris for a while working for Le Figaro and Politico, mostly on politics, but also on investigations. And I've been working in Brussels for 3 years now, recently with Euractiv, covering mostly investigative matters in relation to power, corruption, influence, and the three often collide. So that's what I'm doing.
Fabulous. And you did a very good investigation lately about Euronews. We can maybe revert to that.
I've been with the New York Times for 20 years. I was a correspondent for most of my career. I started out in Paris, actually, as a correspondent for the Herald Tribune at the time, which was already owned by the New York Times, but still carried that name on my first business card. I then became correspondent in London and most recently was bureau chief in Berlin, where my focus was the far right, the rise of the far right, the infiltration of the security agencies there by the far right. So investigative also in that sense, but mostly a correspondent covering the country. And now, yes, as of September, I am hosting this newsletter, which is a kind of a new muscle for me and exciting. The point being that we realized at the New York Times that a lot of readers have become quite fatigued with the news and depressed by the news because the news are hard right now. There's a lot of depressing things going on in the world. And part of our mission at The World newsletter is to sort of be an antidote to the overwhelm. And so we try to keep it short. We try to give you some agency by being analytical rather than just giving you the depressing facts, and also by giving you a bunch of delight from across the world. So culture and recipes and some games and quizzes. So yeah, check it out.
It is very good, I have to say, as is actually the rapporteur of the morning newsletter of Euractiv. But thank you both very, very much for coming. I don't even know how to plunge into this issue. I know that both of you were just amazing and immediately saying, yes, you want to talk about it. Maybe we'll start from that. Elisa, why did you want to talk about it?
Well, as a French woman, I must say that the first time I heard the terrible story of Gisèle Pelicot, obviously this came as a shock. I think that it was something absolutely unseen that we never thought would be possible in our country, but also like in our worst nightmares. And what came first as a shock continued as a shock as we all read the accounts of the trial that went on and how we could see the worst. We could see the worst by hearing how many men came up with some terrible excuses, how the husband of Gisèle Pelicot himself presented this terrifying account of how he drugged and abused his wife for so many years. But we could also see some fascinating things like the level of support of women showing up every day in court to stay silent and just show that they were there for Gisèle Pelicot, but also the women who were crying, carrying placards, the magnificent stories that came up afterwards. I think this was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it. Although I'm not an expert, I wasn't at the trial, I must say. But that was one of the reasons why I wanted to join.
Well, that's a very, very good reason. I mean, I think as a woman, yeah, you've expressed a lot of my sense, at least, about, I don't think there's a good way to talk about it. I think now we're talking about it because Gisèle Pelicot has just brought out a book and she's given some interviews, and that's what ignited within me this desire to talk to other women publicly about this. What about you, Katrin?
Yeah, I feel like there's such a contrast between the Pelicot story and the Epstein story in a way, because the hero of the Pelicot story is Gisèle Pelicot. She is an inspiration to so many women. She's so strong. And I think a lot of us wonder, where does that strength come from? It's incredible. She was asked that question actually by my colleague, and she thought it was just within her, that she was born that way, and that she'd gone through a lot of trials in her early life, and that it sort of given her the strength to stand up here and waive her right of anonymity, which in turn meant that all the men's names were out there too. And that was the important part here, right? But the really big thing is she took agency, right? She refused to be a victim. She took agency by speaking out. And I think all the women who were lining up, as Elisa said, it's so moving to have them sort of, clap her in every morning. And Gisèle said that is what kept her going. So to me, she's the hero of the story. And she's also a huge exception in all stories of sexual abuse, which sort of brings us maybe to the Epstein files. I mean, we'll talk about both stories, but the absolute absence of the women in the way that it's being covered in most places, the way that they're just sort of there in the background. We're talking about the men, really, and some of the women who were present, but mainly we're talking about the men and their political futures and the fallout. And so I think that's what makes the Gisèle Pelicot story in parallel to the Epstein files so powerful.
I think it's intensely powerful. I think we need to emphasize that she didn't have agency when this actually happened to her, because her husband drugged her. And she thought that she was suffering from some form of mental health problem because all the drugs were causing her memory loss, and she found it extremely difficult to deal with her daily life. And it was all because she was being drugged. So the remarkable thing is that when she didn't have agency and these appalling things were done, she then turns the tables and takes the agency completely and exposes these men, especially since apparently the husband finds these men in a chat room called Without Her Knowledge. So the whole point of the event is that she has no agency.
Yeah, I think it's just, as you said, it's like the ultimate sexual domination fantasy here that we're seeing orchestrated by the one man she's trusted the most, who's her husband, and who's also finding people interested in this fantasy. And there cannot be any consent because she's completely drugged. However, this is what brought all these men to this woman. We're talking about a journalist, a fireman, a nurse, like it could be your neighbor. And I think that's one of the things that shocked people in France and outside of France, obviously, is that these men had such random stories, life. Some of them suffered from abuse and had also terrible life trajectories, but they could also be like your neighbor. Yet at night, they were going on this forum looking for this specific type of relationship with a woman.
Although, I mean, I do think we also have to be careful not to make it sound too exceptional that perpetrators are people that are very familiar and potentially your husband. I mean, if you look at rape and sexual abuse, a lot of it is committed. In fact, I believe most of it is committed by people that are in your immediate family environment. I mean, the kind of guy in the park that jumps at you from behind the bush is more of an exception than the father or the husband or the uncle or the family friend. This is something that I didn't cover a lot, but I've covered a little bit. And I remember writing this harrowing story about a Norwegian woman whose husband raped her for years. And of course, for a long time, our own legal systems didn't actually consider rape within marriage to be rape, right? It took many years of changing that, including in my own country, in Germany, where this was a debate in the 90s, I remember. But yeah, so I think Gisèle Pelicot is exceptional. I think her particular case of serial rape is exceptional in the scale of it. But there are some things that are quite ordinary about it too, unfortunately.
Actually, let's have a little exercise. Let's try and work out together what is normal, or not normal, but regular, and what is exceptional. Because actually, I think the exceptional is, for me, is the fact that she's drugged, and that the numbers, but maybe not even the numbers. I don't know. I'm not enough of an expert on repeated rape, but I think it's the drugging by the husband, which seems to be really weird, and all of these men playing along with it.
I think that one of the things that starts as strikingly weird to me is how this whole case started, because you have to remember that it started in 2020 when Gisèle Pelicot's husband was caught filming women in public without their consent. And that's one man working for a supermarket who actually spotted him and decided to intervene. This man had the power to say, "What are you doing? You just stop right there." And the story ended there. But he did not. He called the police, and it turns out that this decision triggered the whole case, because when the police arrested Mr. Pelicot and later found on his hard drive all the videos of not only these women but also of all the rapes that his wife went through, this happened because of this what seemed to be like a tiny incident, a tiny weird incident. And there's been many stories in France about that, and how actually this type of behavior is often like showing a pattern of a psychopathic behavior. And there was a sign that something was off.
It's and it's also interesting because I didn't know the full story there, but it's interesting what you say, Lisa, because it makes me think that civil courage, especially on the part of men, calling this stuff out is really important. And of course, woefully absent in the Epstein case, right? Where hundreds of men knew that they were dealing with a known and registered sex offender. Not only that, but somebody with like abused 14-year-olds, and were willing and okay to hang out with them, even if they didn't commit any abuses themselves. So yeah, calling out weird, as you say, behavior or behavior that is off and is clearly misogynistic is important. Especially on the part of men, I would say.
Absolutely on the part of men. I mean, part of women too, but accepting that behavior is unacceptable. And I think that what we're talking about is the guard in the supermarket saying that isn't acceptable, where that maybe lots of other guards wouldn't even say that. Whereas these hundreds of men, as you say, in the case of the Epstein files, or the Epstein scandal, or the Epstein revoltingness, or whatever we want to call it, they all know and do nothing.
And one of the very interesting thing that you're saying, Katrin, here, I also tie it up to the Epstein case. I also find it interesting in the Epstein case that it's actually female reporters who first broke the story, and they encountered so many difficulties. Like one of them tried to sell a book idea to publishers who were like, "The story that you have is bomb, but I'm never publishing this because this man is too powerful. The risks of litigation are too high." And this is how it went, because when the investigative reporter Julie K. Brown published her now legendary expose in the Miami Herald, it was that triggered the Epstein case. And we haven't talked that much about her and all the difficulties that she encountered since. And again, we're talking about civil courage from this guard who went after Mr. Pelicot's weird behavior. We're talking also about the courage of journalists, but how about all the people who turned a blind eye? I think that's the conversation right now. And we're talking about men who could live with a friend who had been who had been convicted. And there were many women around too, many women who also helped Mr. Epstein.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about this case, and of course, I'm not arguing it's wrong, but it's sort of one of those crazy things that like the only person in prison for this entire scandal is a woman. You couldn't make it up. And of course, she deserves to be in prison, but it is incredible that, no man has been indicted beyond it. Jeffrey Epstein himself, of course, killed himself in 2019 in prison in New York. One thing I learned, and I actually didn't know before, when I spoke to my colleague Mike Goldstein, who has been writing about this forever, since 2019, and he explained to me that the focus of investigators in the Epstein case is very narrowly just on minors. So they're not actually looking at any young adult women who have alleged abuse or anything to do with anyone over 18 is basically not of interest to this investigation, which makes this, it's right that they're looking at minors, but it does mean that it's very narrow, and it gives this sort of slightly false impression that maybe not that much happened, which is frustrating in a way, I think, to a lot of people, because those allegations, any allegations to that effect, are just not being pursued.
I think it was Marina Hyde, the British journalist in The Guardian, who pointed out that, the women have disappeared from the story. All we're talking about are these various powerful men and what happens to them. And, we're talking on Thursday, 18th of February, on the day in which the former Prince Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, has been arrested. But he's not arrested because there's pictures of him with, young women. He's being arrested because the files show that he gave or potentially aided Epstein getting classified knowledge that he was privy to as a trade emissary of the UK. And the same goes for Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, who was the ambassador to the US. In his case, since he's a very well-known gay man, I don't think the issue was ever about little girls, but because he aided and abetted Epstein in very many ways. He's not been arrested. But yes, it's Ghislaine Maxwell, who is obviously a very unpleasant woman and deserves to be sitting in jail. Nonetheless, as you say, the only person sitting in jail over the Epstein crimes is a woman, which somehow beggars belief.
I mean, I read Marina Hyde's piece as well. I thought it was very good and sort of, it's now 2 or 3 weeks ago, so it was quite early. Well, not early in the case, but certainly early in this latest sort of round of coverage after the latest batch of files were released. And she makes that very good point about nobody talking about the women. It's interesting. It reminded me, I covered this grooming scandal in the UK in 2014 when I was London correspondent. And it was absolutely shocking. Elisa, I don't know if this was something that made waves in France, but in the northern city of Rotherham, there was this epidemic of rape, really. There were these grooming gangs of mostly Pakistani men at the time who would groom these young, underprivileged girls, definitely underage, and would basically then drug them and traffic them and share them around. Several of these girls went to the police. It didn't seem like they had much credibility with the police. The police didn't take them seriously. In fact, one of the victims I interviewed for my story at the time told me that on one occasion where she was raped on the street by one of these grooming gang members, she went home to her mum and actually told her mum. And they took her clothes together with all the DNA, like all the evidence, because it was fresh. It had happened that night. They called the police and they gave the police the bin bag with all her soiled clothes from this rape. And then a week later, the police was like, we've lost it. We lost the evidence. Oops. And it was just like, maybe it was an innocent mistake, but there were so many cases of girls reporting these rapes, not being heard by the police. A Labour-run council in the city of Rotherham, apparently too afraid to speak out against these grooming gangs because they were Pakistani British and there may have been allegations of racism and so on. Basically, all the men in the system not helping these women. These women were basically not heard and not just disrespected and raped, but actually completely ignored by the system and let down by the system. And I was reminded in this latest round of Epstein releases of that because of two things. First of all, my colleague Matt Goldstein, who told me that there was definitely a class element to what was going on there. All these women were underprivileged. Many had troubled backgrounds and in some cases had been abused before. A lot of them came from Eastern Europe. So there was definitely a class element to these elite men and women, but mostly men being there and hanging out with these younger, underprivileged women from other countries. And then the system clearly letting them down as well in these latest files that were released, where lots of names of men were redacted, right? But some names of victims who hadn't even gone public, including nude pictures of them, being released. And so, my newspaper, some of my colleagues actually stood up or flagged this and stopped some of the release of this. It shows that the system is definitely, at best, careless and thoughtless when it comes to these victims.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Katrin. I think it was The Economist who had this very good take about how this whole case was also a case of justice denied. And it's strange how it often happens when it's cases of abuse with women that we have this problem of justice denied. I mean, in France, there's been this whole debate about consent and how we could include it in the definition of rape and how the lack of consent equals rape. Trust me, being a French woman who has been through the Me Too wave and its aftermath in France, which, as you know, was a very difficult conversation in a country where so many men for many years bragged about having sex with underage girls, I can tell you that this debate is not over yet. And regarding the justice denied part, one of the things that I find striking in both of those cases actually is that it exposes us to how investigation, and what I find striking with the the Epstein case for a start, indeed, is that you have these millions of documents that are released. Sometimes they are very poorly redacted, and it comes at the detriment of the victims, as you said, who had to go through abuses or very traumatic experience and then see some of the worst moments of their lives, some of the most humiliating moments of their lives, becoming the center of, at times, this very, very murky global attention, because let's not forget that the whole Epstein case is surrounded by conspiracy theories. It all comes with a lot of confusion about how the justice system actually works. But one of the things that I can tell as a journalist who knows a bit how at times the justice system works is that it's incredible to think that all these victims see their life exposed, while the people who took part in this system now have access to so many information that will help them build a case for their defense, be it legal or PR, because we already seeing it. People saying, no, but look at the emails. He said this, but I said that. And what I find worrying is that I'm not sure that all the leads that journalists and curious people will lead to a conviction in the end. I'm not sure that we're going to see a big trial of all the people who have some sort of responsibility in the abuses. I'm not sure we'll ever see that. And I find it quite worrying because when we're talking about criminal offenses like rape, drugging someone, I thought that we agreed as a society that this was something that needed to be prosecuted. And here we are seeing a system where it's public shaming, but weirdly the shame is also on the victim here.
For what it's worth, and I'm very, very far from usually recommending anything on Netflix, I would say that what I found intensely informative, I steeled myself to do it last week, and I did watch this 4-part documentary series from 2020 on the Epstein files, in which the women, some of the survivors, are talking there, but also the journalists. And they're explaining how the whole thing unfolds. So I think that the importance of it, to my mind, is that they've been caught and given the opportunity or captured rather, the opportunity for them to actually, for those who want to hear what actually happened. But I think it's disgusting. First of all, it's disgusting at every level. And we should point out that in the US, at least, this involves sort of famous academics like Noam Chomsky, the head of Bard College, significant people at Columbia and Harvard and other places, involves lawyers, lawmakers, rich people, Bill Gates, sort of. It's just incredible, the spread of people that are involved. And that's why I think it's easier to focus on them for the journalists. Because here I've got 2 very prominent journalists. Why are they focusing on them and not on the women? Go back at you now. Why would a journalist, why would media outlets prefer to constantly focus on that rather than the women at the heart of the matter?
I'm not sure so. I think you have to focus on both, first of all. I don't think we're saying we shouldn't focus on the men. I think they need to be in the spotlight. And I think, again, Gisèle Pelicot made sure by waiving her anonymity that the anonymity of everybody else accused against her was also waived. So I think it's very important that it's out there, that it was not just Stephen Bannon, but also Noam Chomsky, that the Clintons were there, that left and right and from all over the world, men, again, mainly men, were mingling around. And so I'm not opposed to covering that or digging deep on, going after these people and digging deep on what they did and to what extent they were implicated morally or otherwise. But it is true that part of the difficulty of covering women, of course, is that, the access is harder. And having actual conversations with people that are not necessarily public figures is harder. There is less of a record and so on. And partly that's because they're being protected, sometimes insufficiently, but partly it's simply a practical issue for journalists, right? Trying to cover this story. But I think they could be covered more as a group, and they could be represented more in the coverage. Marina Hyde did that and pointed that out. I've tried to do that when I've written about it. I wonder sometimes, and Elisa, I would love your take, to what extent it's deliberate, to what extent it's actually almost a function of having scarce time, having to focus on something, having to produce an article, and then sort of going with something that you can go with, because the women are a much harder lift in terms of confirming who they are, where they are, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you're raising a very fair point. I think that generally speaking, when we're working on our jobs as correspondent, covering politics and so on, like we're already seeing that the people who talk to us the most and who feel very comfortable giving quotes, their opinion on whatever facts that we're submitting to them are men. Like, I think that we just see it. Like, there are so many studies showing that during meetings, it often happens that men speak more often. I'm sure that if we were to look at the stats at the European Parliament, we wouldn't be surprised to find the same kind of outcome. So obviously, as journalists, our coverage also reflects that. And we often have to fight against ourselves, not to go for the easy route and talk to the most visible men there. And I often find it difficult, for instance, when I'm trying to find a female expert, that I have to fight with these women to get them to speak with me. I will often get an answer saying that, no, this is not my field of expertise. I wouldn't dare. And then you reach out to another colleague, and obviously this colleague has not that much expertise, but will not have that many doubts. And I'm sorry if this sounds very cliche, but that's something I've seen so often, and it's really hard to fight against. And then there is the specific case, obviously, of sexual abuse investigations, and that's something so different, because there it's not about whether women dare speaking or not. It's also about protecting them, because we all know that the impact of speaking up for a woman is very different from the impact of speaking up for a man. And there, like, I was reading this excellent profile from your colleagues, Katrin, about how Jeffrey Epstein got rich in the first place and how he managed to get around all these very important people. The profile is amazing, is super meticulous, and you have a lot of people speaking up against Epstein and saying how he was a liar, how he was already using women in order to climb the social ladder, and so on. And many of these sources are men, but you can tell from the reporting from your colleague that they also spoke to a lot of former girlfriends, female colleagues, but they don't dare speaking up. And what we should wonder is why. And we all know why, because the risk of retaliation is so strong. You don't want to have to carry this weight for your whole career.
I think that's a very, very strong point, which is often underestimated. I think women do it automatically in many cases, that we sort of, even if you've got red head and blonde hair and black hair, you sort of, when it comes down to it, and if it's your career and, you just do it automatically, I think. But it's wrong. It's, but I think statistically, as you say, we don't have the statistics in front of us. Have you ever encountered that, Katrin?
What now? What do you mean?
The element of you find it easier to get reactions from men than you do from women if it's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, and I think as a woman myself, I know why. I mean, when I'm asked to speak somewhere, you remember my disclaimer at the very beginning of this conversation. I'm like, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. You know, the famous joke about, you've got a job application that basically says you have to qualify for these. These are the 9 things that you expected to be able to do to apply for this job. And a woman goes, a woman goes, I can't do 6, I can't do 3, I won't apply, And then the man goes like, I could do 1 and 9, I'll apply, It's a sort of, and I hear from friends who organize conferences, when they solicit speakers, women need And in some ways, it's admirable. I think women generally want to feel confident that they know what they're talking about before they're going out there, whereas men are quite happy to wing it. And I think that, I mean, I'm terribly generalizing here, and this is not true for all men and not true for all women, but I think there's something in our societies that just sets the bar a little bit higher for women. And so as a result, yes, it's harder to get women to speak out. But Elisa's point I think is spot on. I think sexual abuse is a particular case. So it's partly on the journalists, perhaps, for not trying enough. Although again, resources, time constraints, etc., investigating sometimes is hard. It's partly also that finding the partners to speak to is that much harder, for sure.
I think it's also it's unpleasant. I mean, tell us about how you felt when you were, reporting this horrific case in the north of England. It couldn't have been easy to go there day after day and speak to anyone from perpetrators to survivors and their families.
Yeah, I didn't speak to perpetrators. By that time, they had been arrested. I spoke to the judge who was investigating this and had written this big report. And I managed to, it was very hard, but I did manage, and it took a lot of time. And Elisa, you'll know this as an investigative journalist. You have to contact a lot of people. You have to write a lot of emails. Sometimes you have to go to somebody's house and slip a handwritten note under the door to win people's trust. You have to give them, you have to persuade them that they can trust you because, because like I said, they've been let down by the system, and their default is not to trust. And so when I did, I was able to find someone who was willing to open up to me on condition of not giving her full name. In fact, not giving and I cleared this with my newspaper. It's rare for us to do that. So I did go with a photographer. We interviewed her for a long time. We toured the city and went to the spot where she was raped that one time when the police lost the evidence. So she really was very open. But the photograph we took in the story, I'll send you the link later, it shows her from the back in her childhood bedroom, but you only see sort of her silhouette. And the first name we use is not her actual first name. So we had to protect her because she wanted to be protected. And I definitely felt we should, and my newspaper agreed. So yeah, that just shows you the level of distrust and fear on the part of victims of this kind of abuse.
And how was it for you interviewing her? I mean, it's not easy dealing with these sort of situations.
You have to go into listening mode. You have to be very open, and then you basically have to let people speak. We made sure that when I was having the conversation with her, because she was still young then, that her mother was there, for example. Eventually, we then peeled off, and I wanted to be sure that her mother was confident. As a mother myself, I have 2 daughters. I wanted to be sure that the mother felt comfortable and confident that I could be trusted. And it was only after a longer conversation involving the mother that I felt confident asking her to show me where some of this had happened. And she then took us out by herself. A lot of it is just going into listening mode, I think, and prompting very gently. You're not an interrogator as a journalist. You are basically there to empower the victim to tell their story and giving them permission to just tell their story in a way. And I think, interestingly enough, in the few instances where this has happened, I mentioned the Norwegian rape victim, there is a kind of moment in the conversation where the dam breaks and it all comes out. It usually takes quite a lot of time to get there, but there will be a point if if it goes well and if they trust you, then there will be a point where they open up. And at that point, there's kind of no stopping it anymore. That's my experience.
Yeah. Amazing. Elisa, do you think that's what happened to Gisèle Pelicot? That once a dam was broken there, once she understood the betrayal?
I've started reading her book, and it seems that at first there was a moment of sideration, of shock. I mean, she wrote that her whole world collapsed. That while the police officer was showing her pictures of her lying in the bed, she couldn't even recognize herself, and she couldn't recognize obviously the men behind her. She had no memories whatsoever. She said that for a while she was silent when her family, her daughters in particular, were expecting her to yell, to be noisy, to be loud. But it took her some time And eventually, yes, she opened up and she took this very brave decision of refusing to stay silent, because in France, for this type of very sensitive case, you can have a trial that is in camera. So obviously, like, reporters can't attend. But here, she decided, as you mentioned earlier, Ilana, she took this decision, and it took her a while to. She said, I can't remember how this translates in English. It was renverser la honte, make
Yeah,
sure that the shame was
Yeah.
not on her
exactly.
side.
She turned the table, right? Like
On the
yeah.
table,
Yeah.
exactly. And this was a very brave decision, and I
Very.
think that in that regard, so many French women have so much respect for her. This was something quite unseen. But yeah, when it comes to reporting on traumatic events, I completely agree with what Katrin just said. You have to be in the listening mode, but also, like, it takes specific training. Like, you cannot go in your reporter mode, like, okay, so when did this happen, and can you describe how this was, and how did you feel at that moment? Like, you have to respect the victims. You also have to take note and at times ask the difficult questions. And it's not something that any reporter can do. It's something that takes practice, because otherwise you risk damaging the victims even more.
I think that's the amazing thing about all the work that you do as investigative reporters, but also coming back to Pelicot and Epstein and her point about you have to inverse the shame, that the other side has got to take it. And isn't it the case that in many ways in the US, that's not happening at a certain level for these girls? The shame, they're not being allowed to put the shame on these men. It's the press that's doing it. But if we go back to the Congress hearing, I think a week ago, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, who was just like, nope, she refuses to apologize to them. And again, everybody focused on the mess that the hearing was, because everybody was shouting at everyone else. In the end, it came down to this amazing Democratic Congresswoman, Representative Jayapal, who asks her to apologize in person, but also gives the opportunity for the survivors that are in the hearing that day in the audience to stand up and identify themselves. But actually, again, they were being diminished, obliterated from the whole discussion, objectified. And that's the part that I tend to find the most difficult in both of these cases, and in general in cases involving abuse of women. It's the objectification of women. And we come back to the website of, without her knowing. That's sort of somehow the ultimate of objectification, sort of without her knowing. She's just the object that we're taking.
And, sort of almost, the sort of leaving the actual sexual abuse to one side for the moment, because again, we're never going to have very clear visibility of that, because the investigation was so narrowly focused just on abuse of minors. But the fact that there were very young women around at all times, that it was sort of almost part of the furniture, and I use this word deliberately to your point of objectification, that people like Richard Branson would refer to Epstein's harem. He's traveling with his harem. Bring your harem. People were aware that there were these young women always present, and they were, like I said, almost part of the furniture. And the sort of objectification was part and parcel of hanging out at Epstein's mansion on Epstein's island. And even though for a lot of these powerful people, the draw may not have been the women, it may have been the other powerful people, which is how this sort of chain worked, right? Whatever you thought about Epstein, himself, you wanted to be in his orbit because there were other people in his orbit that you wanted to hang out with. You wanted to be the person who's part of the gang. But these young women were there always. And so that's morally where I feel like there is, everybody's guilty who went, because it was completely on the record and publicly known since 2008 that this guy was a registered sex offender.
It is incredible. This is such a mind-blowing conversation, but unfortunately we're sort of beginning to move toward its end. Elisa, have the Epstein files had a large effect in France and your beat, the EU, Brussels?
Well, in France, obviously, yes. There's this former culture minister, Jack Lang, who's a sort of very well-known socialite who was leading this major cultural institution in Paris and still part of every important cultural event, who's now embroiled in the scandal. I mean, there had always been suspicions because it was an open secret that he was close to Epstein, who had sent him money to finance a movie. He knew that from 2020, I think. We had reported on it at Politico. And now his whole family is embroiled in this because, of course, we're talking a lot about the abuse part of the Epstein files, but there's also the whole money laundering suspicion part of it and how business works in capitals, be it Paris, New York, or even Brussels, because yes, there is also a Brussels part. Thank God it's way smaller than what we've seen elsewhere. But here we're just seeing powerful people meeting in restaurants. And just to get back to what you were saying, Katrin, about the objectification, this is also something that struck me when I started looking into these emails, is how they speak about women.
Exactly.
We've all been quite surprised. We knew already because we grew up in an era where, like it was in the movie, powerful men often have a beautiful young lady by their side. So this was part of the show, but it's another thing to read them talking about these young, beautiful women. We're talking about like bring some fresh flesh kind of behavior. We're talking about men ironizing about prostitutes all the time. I will not repeat like all the insanities that I've read while going through.
The one that really, I mean, there's so many, and you're right. Every time it's so shocking, even though you kind of should know better, but it's so shocking. The one that really got me was Chomsky, who talks about, who's like, he, in an email to Epstein about Epstein's sort of, case, how the hysteria about, sexual abuse of women had just gone through the roof. The hysteria. And this is Chomsky, who, again, quoting Marina Hyde, famously wrote Manufacturing Consent and talk about consent. Anyways, yes, Elisa, sorry to interrupt, but that I couldn't agree more. It is shocking to see those many emails. I agree.
Yeah. And obviously, like just to close the chapter on Friends, we also have several men who seem to have the same kind of behavior that Epstein seemed to have, which is bragging about their connection, always like inventing themselves a crazy life. There's this former Élysée advisor, for instance, who claimed to be able to connect Epstein with former presidents, and it turns out that as you look into that, these people were no ones, but still that's the striking thing I found about the Epstein case. It's that it also offers a window into this weird world of power and money where you would think that people are more clever than that or smarter than that, but it turns out that just showing up at the country club with a beautiful young woman, an underage, like that should raise alarm. But it turns out that in the finance world, sometimes it can actually be taken as a sign that you made it, and this seemed to be the conclusion of so many of these great investigations that we read in the New York Times or elsewhere, or as we dig into these terrible emails, that it's just as bad as it looks.
I mean, the big question on my mind as we wrap is, how much of this is still going on and where? Like, to the earlier part of our conversation, these things get found out sometimes by chance. I mean, who knows what else is going on? And I guess after the last sort of 15 years of revelations in various countries with various degrees of horribleness, it's quite easy to get cynical, about this stuff happening still quite a lot, even today.
Yeah, and worse than that maybe it won't really change anything.
And also to wrap it up, I think that Katrin, earlier you said that there was a question of class here, be it in the Epstein case, but also in the Pelicot case, because we have two sides of the coin here. Because on one hand, you have this man, Epstein, who came from a not so privileged milieu, quite the working class kind of background, who climbed the social ladder with the help of many women, and then had this very perverse type of attitude and criminal at times, like we're talking about a convicted criminal. And on the other hand, you have the polar opposite, which is Ms Pelicot, who was an electrician who accumulated debt and appeared as the perfect husband, but also had this completely hidden perverse life with also like a lot of working class men. So I find that putting these two in perspective is quite interesting, because it shows that it's not something that is confined to the elite, because around the Epstein case, you have this big fantasy about this pedophile ring among the elites. You have a lot of conspiracy theories about how this might be connected to secret services, rich people. That's also why journalists, I think, have been focusing on certain names. But let's have a look at the Pelicot case. This is way more common than we think.
It's the common denominator is men at whatever stage they're at in society with power over the woman, either because the woman is drugged or because the woman is a much lower class than you, like, right? That seems to be sort of the connective.
And young.
tissue.
And young. In the case of the other men.
That's correct. Yeah. So it's a sort of a power differential, right? It's like it's men who clearly, I mean, the one thing in common with all these perpetrators is that it's sort of men exercising power over women, right? And that power can be class power, or it can be, well, or you drug someone and deprive them of all power. But yeah, okay, so we're kind of at the end, but I wanted to I thought it was so interesting what you just said, Elisa, about the sort of the way that these scandals fuel conspiracy theories. I think it's so interesting because there is a level, of course, you have to admit, where, Pizzagate or QAnon and all these sort of crazy conspiracy theories are built on these kernel of truths about, some abuse happening at the hands of the elite. That's about it. But that's quite important, at a time when basically people have lost all trust in institutions, right? Which is why this has become, I think this is why politically it's such a sort of tricky case, because the broader public believed already that the elite was sort of rotten. And in a way, this suggests that they're not entirely wrong.
Well, we could do this for so much longer. So I think the only solution is going to be to have you two back as soon as maybe something further happens in these really disgusting cases. But I think that I completely agree that this is about the need, to my mind, for men to show power or have a sense of power. And that's what I find the most disturbing, if you think about it. It's not just that, so if you don't have the power, then you will drug a woman, or you'll go for underage poor women, or but it's the need for men to somehow exhibit power. And of course, part of the power is then also having sex, imposing yourself physically on another woman. That's a rather dire place with which to end this amazing conversation. So really, thank you so much to the two of you. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And that's a wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word or sad word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beit-El, together with my friend and producer Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.